Good afternoon, wherever you are. This is Barrett Watten, and I decided that I wanted to make a second take of my grand piano reading because, in the rush to get going with the live event in front of an audience, I neglected to pin the speaker, and so the recording shows the entire gallery, but not the speaker. And so I thought I would do a second take. Uh, the the first take was on November 17th. It's now 10 days later. And in that reading, I introduced my procedure for sampling the grand piano, which I observed in making a text. I sampled the 10 volumes 30 times and basically constructed a reading out of 15 of those samples. And the samples were broken down into three areas, which could correspond to beginnings, middles, and ends, as I discuss in an article I wrote on the grand piano. But they could also correspond to Bruno Latour's concept of actor, network, and theory. So beginnings and actors, and middles and networks, and then ends and theory seem to find some kind of commonality. And I talked a little bit about some of the ideas behind my approach to the reading, but I think the one thing I do want to do is read the paragraph from Otto Weininger's um, early 20th century work, Sex and Character, which was a big influence on Gertrude Stein and the Making of Americans. And Weininger proposed a project of what he called theoretical biography. And I think Stein's Making of Americans is really, to some extent, informed by that idea of a theoretical biography. So I'd transfer that over to my take on the grand piano. And so this is from Weininger. All thinking begins with intermediate generalizations and then develops in two directions. One towards concepts of even higher abstraction, which encompass ever larger areas of reality by registering properties shared between ever more things. The other toward the intersection of all conceptual lines, the concrete complex unit, the individual, which we can only approach in our thought with the help of an infinite number of qualifications, and which we define by adding to the highest generalization a thing or something, an infinite number of specific distinguishing features. So herewith my sampling of the grand piano. Correcting proofs of many moments of error and vulnerability, and I experienced many at the time, so intense that I thought they could be literally fatal for anyone who witnessed them. I can think of several people, in fact, who have since died as a result of having witnessed my error and vulnerability, or so I thought. For this reason alone, it is essential to overcome such defective aspects of one's personality. This is not merely a matter of personal growth and awareness. Whitman, too, was a corrector of the proofs of his own error and vulnerability. Such dangerous vulnerability is what Leslie Scalapino risked when she titled her first book, The Woman Who Could Read the Mind of Dogs, or Kit when he titled an unpublished manuscript, Running Dogs. Terms such as running dog or lackey had an insinuating connotation from the leftist press of the period, meaning one who was a mere servant to a structure of power he could do nothing about. But we would do something about it, risk our coherence in order to establish the grounds from which we would speak. The risk of coherence was the imperative to locate the limits one was in, limits of knowledge, reason, the possibility of statement. Bergson's rejoinder to such concerns at the time was decisive. All bottoms are false. But I was a Marxist, not an ironist, and had to locate the grounds of my belief in a relentlessly methodical way, or one could simply give up and move to New York, where it's turtles all the way down. Later readings in pragmatism would help overcome such need for underlying support. I was not Martin Eden, but like him, had a problem with class. Why not be conscious of it? I remember Creeley saying, the problem with you guys is you're intellectuals to a feat. Why don't you get off it and talk to the people? And then being invited for dinner at M's, whose upscale housemate had just bought a painting that was reproduced in a review of the artist show in the Chronicle the day before. Now it was hanging in his apartment. Art as property. What a novel idea. An idea that novels like Martin Eden were written to disprove. In the indeterminate cinema of social reproduction, perspective illusions unfold. The saga of the aging Michael Douglas as he adjusts himself to each new role. Only last night, he was the father of a freebasing high school honor student after having been appointed federal drug czar. Then in the morning, I learned that in his new comedy, Michael Douglas reinvents his career as a morally compromised creative writing professor. Generational affiliation and its discontents. This is the framework of a narrative that unfolds between plots. In yet another incarnation, Michael Douglas exits the symbolic order via a scene of mistaken identity following an aggressive sexual encounter. Demi Moore is his avatar of desire. His task is to return himself quickly to production. Does the father offer protection? This is the problem Michael Douglas explores in each of his generationally stereotypical roles, a dilemma that parallels his life, as he is the son of a famous actor. As we assume, Michael Douglas wants to have it both ways, but he cannot. His destiny comes pre-inscribed, and he can only act within certain limits. He cannot at once inherit the privileges of class and kind, while remaining open to history nonetheless. Thus, he is consigned to his fate, determined from the outset by the conditions of his birth, conditions that are circumscribed to begin with, as we find out. I had hoped the comrade I was with would help in the cause of identifying the proper mode of work I should engage. Labor was the imaginary. When we had first met, she had heard of my work as a poet that someone had not understood me. She asked if I wanted to be famous. I said I wanted to be known. Poetry was the site of an intensity waiting for confirmation and release, physical metaphors of charge and discharge, revolutionary science, and there had been others. Rosa Luxemburg, W.P.A. Murals, Louis Zukowski, Anna Hartman. What was the confirmation of not being understood? That obscurity would cast one's lot in with the fate of revolutionary organizations that needed to double in size every year. Breton praised the lucidity of Trotsky's autobiography, the purity of its prose. The first thing I did on arriving at MIT was to purchase an anthology of Trotsky's writings. I remember his speech to the Red Army. The Socialist Club held their meetings in the student lounge. Noam Chomsky attended, observing from the back row. We do not need to rehearse the debates of the 30s, someone said. The anti-war movement would begin in a matter of weeks with the march on Boston Common. I was 17 and wore a black armband. The House advisor, a history major, recruited me for the club and said, if you're on the left, you're going to get fucked. This all seemed quite heroic. When the great blackout of 1965 took place and the lights went off in the Boston skyline across the Charles, my friend, a CP member at 18, said, it must be the Trots. I helped man their tables for the rest of the year. I do not remember much about the founding of the Grand Piano Poetry Series in 1976. I had been approached by a poet, M., whose work I did not particularly care for, nor care about either. We would split responsibility for the program. I would typeset and produce a flyer. Certain feelings still cluster around the choice of font. Caledonia Bold. We had one meeting that summer. Archival evidence shows the first reading in the series was by Sandy Berrigan and Maria Gittin. I organized a total of 8 readings that fall, at which point I handed the series and the mailing list over to Tom and Ron. Carla, Steve, Ray, and Ted took it from there. M said, I heard later, that he was disappointed that a community of poets did not develop out of the series for him. N was a woman of petty bourgeois background who was torn by revolutionary desire. Her father was a personal litigation lawyer in Houston. She was an ironic militant in the best sense. Our actions only coincide with history or they do not exist. The political life is an abstract theoretical commitment to this view. Poetry can express it precisely insofar as the truth of history cannot, in the end, be lived, insofar as one is in contradiction with it. Her commitment led her to a revolutionary party and its ontology of choice. I remained outside it, fascinated but repelled, the better to interiorize the destiny of my class and kind. After we split, she moved to Chicago, where she had some trouble with a fellow cadre, I later heard, before returning to our relationship for a last brief period of intensity. Whatever the turn to language might mean, it was also lived. I remember trying to capture the hybrid neutrality of everyday life in its most repetitive forms through a use of language that had been stripped of all associations. I was attracted to an inaccessibly neutral language that might become the underpinning of any experience, as Clark Coolidge might put it, a carrier wave. If only one could return to a carrier wave of unmarked experience as language, one would realize the basis of all expression, even the quotidian norms of the middle class. Not that all expression was a realistic goal, since what had been restricted in our experience of everyday life could only be convertible as some kind of oceanic feeling, which we rejected on principled grounds. This was beyond conceptual art, which stayed at the level of the concept in its relation to manifold contexts. The hybrid neutrality of unmarked expression, condensing oceanic feelings, was a formal allegory for me then. City Fields. I intended to write a history of the intersection of 16th and Potrero streets as the place where all the traffic comes from. Such a history would be the opposite of an opening out, a retrospective looking in, a contribution to anonymous history, one may say, in poetic form. What could be more anonymous than streetcar wires crossing under leaden skies, condensed in a hybrid neutrality as representing the possibilities and limits of expression? But why did history insist on presenting itself in such a reconstructed form of anonymity? Wouldn't bombs raining down over Hanoi provide a better figure for politics, as symbolic will? I rejected the oceanic unfoldings of myth and its lure of elusiveness. I wanted to place my emphasis literally elsewhere, at the intersection of 8th and Division Streets, place names. What I saw at the fire site was literally what I have always thought and said. In that seminar, the original model, as far as I am concerned, for all such seminars to come, the Utopian Reading Group, the Collectives Talk Series, the Poetics Listserv in the Sky, we read the modern epic, beginning with Pound, Williams, Olson, and ending with Robert Grenier's A Day at the Beach, then a 2-volume tome, one short poem to a page, arguably as much the sunset of Western man as the Maximus poems, though Grenier left any historical work on why that should be so to others. I do not think we read Zukowski's A, or if we did, it was only mentioned in passing. The poem was available in the 1967 and 1969 Jonathan Cape and Paris Review editions, which of course I had, but maybe not at the time. The seminar ended with the other graduate students rejecting my proposal that Grenier's A Day at the Beach continued the tradition of the modern epic, though Sherman Paul took the idea seriously and was solicitous of Grenier when he came through to give a well-publicized reading I organized later that spring. I remember from that event the self-canceling nature of Grenier's presentation, as well as the row of Iowa stalwarts sitting in the back: Marvin Bell, Donald Justice, Norman Doobie, Roger Weingarten, who snickered through the whole thing and thought Grenier had lost his mind. Perhaps the problem with this, if not its demonstration in the pages of this, was that it did not capture the larger truth of Ron's method, his way of writing sentence after sentence, the totality of poetic form. In being so mired in particulars, one may never see the horizon of totality, the bigger picture, the encompassing whole. But isn't it precisely in the mode of negation, of refusing to accept the horizon of particulars, even though it is right in front of you, that the bigger picture starts to dawn? It seemed that what the stress on particularity wanted was the reverse, a going beyond this toward a kind of particularity that could no longer be merely called up in the act of referring. Not an obdurate material fact, but a different relation, a difficult relation of language, a purely relational determination in the space opened up between things and the language used to refer to them, the gaps between words and things, rather than the positive existence of either. The denial of this, of all acts of pointing to something out there that could be labeled that, thus accedes to a relation between such acts as precondition of the total form. The denial of this becomes a test of adequacy of the representation of others as well. You are not in the place I had reserved for you. Relation is predicated on that which is not. I am led in the direction of saying the adequacy of representation or the inadequacy of particulars is not the primary reason for that not. Non-referentiality must then defer before it enters into any relation to that not as an intentional act. Not an intentional act. What is going on here? Wittgenstein turned inside out, rabbit and duck marching hand in hand toward the horizon of language? To what were we refusing to refer? Or were we more directly referring to a specific refusal as an actually existing state of affairs? Once, walking in the Sierra foothills, I picked up a rock, one of many in a field of rocks, all of which were red, volcanic, the tufa Earth admits, mere matter, which we confront. That rock has also survived, coming to rest on a shelf in a Midwestern suburb. For an article on language, I wrote about a blue rock, the me and the not me, in a form of aesthetic displacement, if not marked disavowal. If wishes were rocks or another form of material displacement, they would be this writing. The contingent event of friendship, elsewhere, in New York, with others whose interests are not the same, or in the city where I now live, the modern dystopia. Jack Spicer, we will build our city, but not in New York or Detroit. Why did Spicer write only for readers in San Francisco, imagined or real? In his dysfunctional romance of friendship, community folded into the dark sun of a destructive wish, so that later, more truly informed, we would look toward our friends and admire the dark spots of their celerity, a tattoo to be worn on one's sleeve. The status of friendship remains open as a displaced ideal, seeking materialization. It begins with an inquiry concerning the location of others. If polis is this, we must determine where we are. The writing of poetry takes place within the claims of community founded on the possibility of friendship. Meanwhile, a citizen of our Republic of Letters wanted us to think he was the next Baudelaire. That would be the ultimate betrayal of the other in himself. But anyway, we were never friends. A possibility of friendship. We would talk, each outsaying the other. Each sentence jumped on and pushed out to the next line of argument. No line of argument was ever completed. It left us with only a nonstop experience of a destructive wish, which we willed, enjoyed, and outlasted. Horses. Who will do it? Before the flowers of friendship faded, our talk faded down the wishful defiles of its imagined canyons. Friendship between come on and lament. The transmission of poetry is a passion unlike any other. I experienced that directly with Grenier. In one version, transmission occurs from poet to poet in a patrilineal descent, producing anxiety of influence as a byproduct. The grand piano, as a form of collective self-inquiry, offers another, more spatial model for transmission. In moving from one to the other, we may imagine to have departed from the notion of the literary that defined us in the period we are writing about, as transition from embodied speech to writing on the page, for instance, toward a more adequate understanding of the task of literature in the period we are writing in. The transformation of Grenier's work, along with my sense and use of it from one frame to the other, often seemed nothing short of total eclipse. The obdurate moon of mediated reflection has eclipsed the generative sun of the verbal energy and drive that inspired me then, such that they are reversed. Obdurate in the sense that something standing in the way of making meaning leads to reflection. Generative in the sense that what furthered it led to a block. Grenier was a generative figure whose writing intentionally, and as a result of his situation in the world, stood as a self-defined limit of possibility condensed in acts of self-canceling paradox. In fact, as a continuous series of them. For many, his work has become a monument or touchstone of the impossibility of poetry in the world that denies it. For me, the question of agency is irreducible to form, however iconoclastic. In preparing to write on Grenier, I turned to my archive, the bulky file of letters, postcards, handwritten poems, publication work, and grant proposals, housed for the moment in a filing cabinet in my office. While Grenier was pure verbal immediacy in manner and content, his was a pressured speech. I can also track the mechanics of transmission in the form of the letters he wrote, from their original moments of hailing to their later handwritten opacity. On one sheet, with a pencil date of 1971, I find the following in large, childlike script. Hello there, Barrett Watten. Why did I call you late at night, as it were? The authors are in eternity, but we were in everyday life. Under the aspect of materiality, Louis Zukofsky was our name for the unnameable paradigm shift of the moment, unlinked from his actual position in a Hegelian unfolding toward a violent anti-historicism, literariness of poetics. The first step along the way to undoing our learned Marxism toward a moment in which we are Democrats, but we have no name. An historical emptiness that would be converted into a politics, a poetics, if only. The day on which I wrote Silence, the centerpiece of 1 to 10, was a Saturday like any other writing day. I had been browsing in an academic edition of Donne, caught up by the notes. What does paraphrase mean for a reading of Donne? The night before, I had had dreams of excessively violent proportions. Every detail of the dream was vivid and perceptible as I wrote, fitting subjective correlatives of the dream into the language of the footnotes to Donne. As well, the literal content of the dream survived for some time afterwards. I remember telling this to Dee with a certain amount of hubris, as if to say, my dream is so much a fact of the present that not writing it down both signifies and doesn't need to, and that is the content of the poem. Of course, I have since then I have forgotten the dream entirely. Perhaps I wrote Silence in the middle of the night before having the dream I later remembered as recording. I still think I will somehow recover the dream from deep within the interior to this day. As for noise, on 14 January 1978, the Sex Pistols gave what was to be their last concert at Winterland Auditorium. I remember the posters for the event, even an excited buzz at its approach, and a review in the Chronicle that praised the spectacle with no mention of the chaos and confusion going on backstage. That is for another account, not mine, I would not have given a thought to going to an apocalyptic show in that period. Likewise, I passed up a ride to Altamont in December 1969, another key moment of the history that forms and deforms us. What is the imperative of popular culture? In the same period, Louis Althusser's concept of hailing gained currency as a theory of individuation at the behest of the mass. I say, ideology hails us, and we respond, it's me. How very original. To know ourselves in myriad instances of collective address, each with its own memory trace. I say, in the late 70s, popular culture was a redundant bore, that rock music in particular wallowed in stale ideas, and that something like a new measure was necessary. For some, it may have been Donna Summers's I Feel Love. For me, without question, it was to be hailed by Anarchy in the UK. Within the year, I made my first trip to England, where I hooked up with Eric Mottram, Alan Fisher, and Chris Cheek. I remember, apropos popular culture, taking in The Godfather Part 2 when it appeared in 1974. This was in a theater out on the avenues, probably in the company of N. When Kay informs Michael that she has aborted his baby, a chorus of displeasure welled from the crowd. Bitch, a black man hurled from the back. When I visited New York in the 70s, I often stayed on Bowery Street across from CBGB's. Not once did I go in. Quite clearly, we were too busy making our own scene. If there were a question of culture, it was going to be our own response. I'm sorry I missed the Sex Pistols and CBGB's. Had I been at Winterland that night, I would have heard God Save the Queen, EMI, Holidays in the Sun, No Feelings, and Pretty Vacant. My education would have begun right there. Destructive envy. What writer doesn't know what that means? Stendhal made great literature out of destructive envy through his constant undermining of the certainty of the object of desire. Allen Ginsberg made it a politics out of rivalry between men, the basis of utopian community. For us, it was the countervailing tendency of friendship, the abstract negative of community itself. The steady state of friendship, friendship as an art, a necessary entailment of the arts. I remember in the period of minimal employment and low cost of living, that was the late 70s, how much time I spent attending to the details of friendship. It was not simply seeing oneself in an other, but a constant contact with the exteriority of being. Walls break off where I am met. The much vaunted ethics of the other would be tested at the limits of the creative act in the construction of aesthetic community. Else the provocation of the other is reinvested in the fantasy of the whole, totality, all there is. The politics of utopia begin here, in the dawning awareness that the other cannot be tolerated. Hence, a higher state of communion is imagined in which everyone will behave in ways that have been decided in advance, that are regular and regularizable. The ecstasy of the other, a vision founded in the crisis of alterity, is the originary place where such rigidifying fantasies of the whole unfold. Two options result that one ought to avoid: to maintain coherence of self in denial of the other's assault by projecting a totalizing unity outward, or to link identity with the other by reducing it to an element of the same. Hegel incorporates both in his conservative defense of spirit. An alternative, less controlling defense, more open to preserving the difference of what confronted me to begin with, would be to transform elements of alterity into a chain of identity that spreads outward and beyond. We may call this the politics of identification. I would not stoop to allegory. If my motives were entirely clear to me, they would be to elaborate or put into play the terms by which a poetics may be constructed. Jodie Foster, poster child of gender theory, explores the alterity of interstellar space in Contact, directed by Robert Zemeckis, 1997. As a lengthy article in Wikipedia explains, the story follows the relentless efforts of the film's protagonist, Foster, to search for evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence by listening for contact via radio astronomy, which would be the greatest achievement for the history of history. The film explores what might happen if such contact indeed were made and the enormous difficulties of coming to understand that event. Portentous discussions about relativism and truth follow this allegory of science seeking to know itself through an outside. This is not Jack Spicer's outside, nor Jean Cocteau's, though they may be compared. I remember being riveted by the premise until undeveloped plot conflicts unraveled the film's credibility. Still, as the surrealists would have liked, some improbable and gorgeous non sequiturs are staged as scenes. One concerns instructions that sentient beings elsewhere sent to Earth embedded in an undecodable historical image of Hitler's address to the 1936 Olympics, no less. Embedded in the image are complete instructions, as from an erector set, for building a three-dimensional machine for single-occupant space travel, its exact purpose unknown. This is the film's first oniric scene. The second occurs when the resulting machine itself is built. As influence of gender theory, to be sure, it is pointed not outward to expansive domination, but inward toward the dimensional core of Earth, a feminist vehicle that will propel Dr. Arroway, Jodie Foster, into the unknown, not to dominate it, but to know it in another way. I do not remember what she finds out, and have only skimmed the synopsis. In the third gorgeous scene, Dr. Arroway, in her trans-dimensional vehicle, scuds between parallel worlds, a vision of immortality. The rest of the plot turns out not to be worth the effort, so I leave her suspended there in interstellar space. Perhaps she never really went anywhere. Her recording devices show only static. What really occurred is a matter for debate. Somehow my plans have somehow gone astray here. So this will be the, Linneman, the swerve of this particular reading. We resume. Whatever the turn a rather lengthy hiatus here. Well, the missing instructions, there we go, disclose themselves. Resuming. Between sex and work, there was writing, or so it seemed at the time. The point of writing this now is that there is an upgrading of oneself that should be discouraged in terms of what motivated me then. If there is a writing of history, as Charles Olson said, we need to see the roots, where one is coming from. Between X and Y, there is nothing. The point of writing this now is that certain aspects of self, non-self really, are inadmissible later in art. One needs to stick to one's understanding of that point. A point that recurs in its protensions and retentions, generalized forward and rescripted backwards. What I wanted was a total syntax, the use of a total syntax to make a statement that is a work of art. One's life is predicated on a series of choices. This is the path I have taken, apart from any other. When I gave my father a copy of my book by that name, his comment was, You must mean total sin tax. I did not publish another book of criticism for 18 years, but will have done so by the time that remark has found its resting place in history. Total syntax. There are a few boundaries of time and space in this version of my account. Protensions and retentions, rewriting my life backward and looking forward from the certain knowledge that it would have been. That is the version I intended. Just so, I remember back through miles and miles of memory, a sequence of telephone poles stretching into the horizon on a flat plain in Nevada. It was not Route 66, but the song was playing on the radio, driving forward, the telephone poles flowing backward in the rearview mirror. I can remember back to each of them, from which point I can discern the one previous. And then I remember having this thought when I was 8 years old, thinking the telephone poles were extending even farther back into the past, to when I was 2, to earlier. I've always known myself at isolated moments of recalling this sequence, even as I know myself in writing it down now. It is the first time I have written it down, though it is hinted at in numerous of my works. It is their inherent structure. I've always known I would write it down, and that it would be the truth of knowing myself since the series first began. This is the moment when I commit that knowledge to the page. Let it not be erased. I want to think forward from that point to the next. Believe me, I am a poet and a professor. I inherited the chair of poetry from my noble predecessor, having been singled out from hundreds of job applicants. I practice a bastardized will to power as poetic correlative to my original disavowal of mere existence, such that nothing of my origins will survive except my original and bastard professorship. No, nothing like that has ever been said, nor should it have been. I am a poet and professor teaching poetics and modernist studies in Detroit, where I learn every day about the world my students come from and the world I am in. Legitimacy stems from the moment of that encounter, as it has all along. That includes the legitimacy of poetry, which is to deny mere existence as an argument of power, and to refuse inheritance as a transmission of its force. A professor is of very low rank. A philosopher is of higher rank than a professor. A poet is also of higher rank than a professor. Poet and professor are of superior rank, as opposed to the deficient status of the professor. The door is open to poets and philosophers, original geniuses and gods of theory. But poetry wants an equivalence, whereas philosophy wants a hierarchy. Or is it the other way around? Professors are thought to teach what has already been accomplished, while poets and philosophers make their works and discourse on truth for all time. I remember talking with the editor at UC Press, who helped bring out A, and later the first book of Zhukovsky criticism, which Ron immediately criticized in Poetics Journal, about our production, particularly its opacity. She said, yes, it's like my Jewish relatives, everyone trying to talk at the table at the same time. At the same time, A24 is the apotheosis of the Christian tradition, possibly one of the most redemptive moments in American literature. See him? Whom? The Son of Man. Was all that redemptiveness being written, as it were, with tongue in cheek? On my bookshelf, I have a work of critical theory titled Perversion and Utopia. Would that be a good guide to Zhukovsky? Was he putting us on? Was the obduracy of his writing perverse or transcendent? And how would we know? A form of misdirected aim, gesticulating all the while deferring entry into Jerusalem. Were we participating in a grand joke at the expense of our entry into tradition, or were we signing our names in blood to a higher order of retrospectively confirmed literariness that would, in a reassuring way, contain us and all the cacophonous eruptions of this moment of filial piety to our modernist master? For all our careful scoring of textual emphasis, Were we of the avant-garde the original misreaders? In the event, I had a suspicion that something like that might be the case, that we had in part misrecognized Zhukovsky's endorsement of our own arguably more radical project. At the same time, we wanted his endorsement. We wanted to claim him as our own. And we were in love. Note that the concept of we here has perceptibly changed. Suspicious of each other, we entered into the binding constraints of a publicly authorized performance, eyes fixed straight ahead, concentrating on our task and the text in hand, which was to give over to render Zhukovsky in a form that would be meaningful as it was directly addressed to the outer limits of what in language could be known. We performed the text as if it could be known in language in order to have that knowledge, to assume it as our own. We were married by Zhukovsky in the state of modernist apotheosis, county of temporal crisis. Later, in temporal fact and legal fiction, as it happened, we were married in the state of California, county of Alameda, in the same Alameda County Courthouse where Edwin W. Meese, later Attorney General, ruled the roost for many years as one of the last representatives of the old guard Republican oligarchy that made the city of Oakland mean what it did to everyone at the time: oppression. There's a famous photograph of Black Panther Party members raising their fists at the Art Deco monument of the Alameda County Courthouse. I was in the crowd of supporters that witnessed that salute. Later, Meese would return as facilitators of the Meese Commission report, another document of oppression. Let us pause to remember Edwin W. Meese. As I later wrote, our marriage domesticated the courthouse. This writing is his tombstone. We survived.